because what matters is that I believe it, or rather know. Not that I believe it, but that I believe it. I trust I make myself obscure.
This is Criteria.
Hey everybody, welcome to a special bonus episode of Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast. This is Thomas Miras, here by myself today doing a straight interview rather than the sorts of film discussions you normally hear on this show. We recorded a discussion separately of the film A Man for All Seasons, which is on the Vatican film list. Of course, it's based on Robert Bolt's play about St. Thomas More, my patron saint, whose feast day it is today. One thing I've wanted to discuss is the degree to which the play and the film accurately reflect More's views on conscience, the freedom of the conscience, individual freedom, religious liberty, topics like that, which are actually very current as well in Catholic political thought right now, and being sort of reevaluated in different ways. It's also interesting to me as someone who's under the patronage of Thomas More, because I'm not necessarily someone who wants to just throw him under the bus when it comes to, say, his treatment of heretics. I don't want to automatically assume that those things are either wrong or incompatible with his stand on freedom of conscience with regard to his own martyrdom by Henry VIII. So I have here to discuss these things with me Louis Karlin. He is an attorney for the state of California, the co-author of a book called Inside the Mind of Thomas More from Scepter Press. He's also the co-editor of Thomas More's Trial by Jury, a procedural and legal review with a collection of documents, which I'm sure any lawyer will find very, very interesting. He's also a founding fellow of the Center for Thomas More Studies at the University of Dallas. Lou, welcome to Criteria.
What a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I found it interesting to read Robert Bolt's introduction to the play the other day, where he kind of lays out some of his personal interest in the figure of Thomas More. He talks about the problem of modern man no longer having a strong sense of self. Scholars relate everything back to economic and social causes and group identity. Of course, that's something you can very much see in various forms of Marxian thought or, social determinism. But on the contrary, More had a very strong sense of self, he said. He goes on to discuss the concept of an oath as a serious contract in which, as More says, you take yourself in your hands. And he says that moderns don't understand an oath as a serious contract because they don't have a supernatural worldview. Bolt continues to say that, in his opinion, we need to find a way to have a sense of self without what he calls magic. I'm assuming he just means the supernatural by that. So he uses that as his sort of justification and partial apology for setting More, a Christian saint, as what he calls a hero of selfhood. So I just wanted to sort of go through that to set the stage for our discussion here, because it's a good way to launch first a more general discussion of kind of the conception of self itself that Bolt lays out in this play in the person of Thomas More. So my first question to you, I guess, would be, to what degree do you think Bolt actually does in the play and in the film alter the character of Thomas More in general terms, or transform him from a Christian saint into a modern hero of self? To what degree is it a transformation? To what degree is it an emphasis of certain traits that More did have that are appealing to moderns?
Well, you get right to the main criticism of the play, of the movie. Really serious, important scholars have roundly criticized the film as saying that it's, I guess would be that it's fairly accurate historically, but inauthentic as to the real More, and precisely because of the stand on conscience. In an article that I wrote, I think we need to push back. I think that's overstating what's happening. I think that's taking Bolt's introduction and his aims, and confusing what actually happens in the play. So the scene that important scholars focus on, and this would be from John Finnis to historian John Guy, the key scene is where More is explaining to Norfolk why he will not take the oath. More is talking about apostolic succession and whether the Pope is the descendant of St. Peter, and that's something he believes. And Norfolk says, well, all this for a belief. And More, the character, says, well, it's something that I believe in. But he says, no, it's not that I believe, but that I, emphasizing the I, but that I believe. And so for these readers, these critics, the problem is that More is elevating the self as the determinant of what is true. And that is a very modern conception. You could trace from Descartes up through Camus, I suppose, who in the introduction, that's who Bolt says, where do I get off? Essentially turning Thomas More into a Camus-like hero. So that's the problem. And so you've identified that. And the question is, does the movie really show that? And I think this is worth discussing because I don't think that the play actually does that. That if you look closely, and this comes through in the play and in the movie, Bolt makes it very clear that More's stand on conscience is absolutely tied to the truth.
Yes.
The Catholic understanding of conscience is that you align your beliefs and your actions, you judge your actions according to a standard of truth, what is good and what is true. And the modern self, if this was really a modernist play, would say that the self is the determinant, is the creator of truth itself, that we decide what is true. And I don't think that Bolt, the character created by Bolt, actually does that. And we can look at certain scenes. I think a fascinating one, if you recall, there's a scene where More is being interrogated by Cromwell, Norfolk, and the Archbishop. And the question is to More, look, you say that this is capable of doubt, the issue with signing the oath. You're doubting that, but at the same time you have an undeniable duty of allegiance to the king. So weigh a doubt against an obligation and sign.
Right. A certainty, yeah.
A certainty,
yeah.
Exactly. And what's More's response here? And this is really interesting because it shows Bolt being quite a modernist, and yet look what he does. He says the speech is along the lines of, some people say the world is flat, and others say that it is round. It is matter capable of doubt. But if the king...
I wish Bolt hadn't chosen that as his example.
Well, isn't that interesting? But
since nobody actually thought that.
Well, I think Bolt chose this for a very interesting reason, that he's thinking of the Brecht play of Galileo, where the church is painted in a terrible light, unfairly, as condemning a man for believing what is scientifically true. But what does Bolt have More say? He says, can the king's command make it flat? Can the king's command make it round? It can't. I will not sign. What More is saying here in the play is that my stand on conscience is based on what is true, what I know to be true, not merely that I hold some belief.
Right.
So I think that's one interesting example there. More having a sense in the play that he actually would have, that the stand on conscience is based on the alignment of one's beliefs and one's actions with the truth.
It seems to be kind of a multi-level thing because he, in one point in the first passage you mentioned where he says, what matters is not that I believe it, but that I believe it. He's emphasizing that it's the relevant factor is that it's his conscience, and that he can only exercise his own discernment, guided by God, of course, and ultimately cannot sort of abdicate that duty of discernment that every rational being has. On the other hand, in the passage that you just cited, the emphasis is that discernment is definitely oriented towards objective truth, the possibility that he might be getting it wrong acknowledged, but also somewhat besides the point, in a case where also relevant in a case where the church hasn't spoken definitively, or he's acknowledging the possibility that even if it has, he's misunderstanding it or something like that. But so it has this multi-level thing where he manages to both affirm the fact that it's quite important that this is his conscience, but also that it is oriented towards objective truth without sort of like making the mistake of absolutely identifying one with the other, either in the sense that one's subjective conscience it sort of should rule over all, or in the sense that one could simply sort of farm out one's conscience, to the church, even though we are forming our conscience by means of the church's teachings. It's not quite true to say that we can simply say they're one and the same. I suppose that's the ideal, to be, one with the mind of Christ, but we can't just sort of presume on that all the time.
Absolutely. And Moore is is easily one of the most important writers on the question of conscience and its role as a citizen, as a statesman. In a letter that he wrote, the letter is actually attributed to his daughter, Margaret, to her sister-in-law. But it's very clear that Moore and Margaret either wrote it together or Moore wrote it himself. And it's based on a long conversation they had while he was in the Tower. And it's all based on where its role is in deciding how to act in the face of an unjust law.
So we're going to have a dramatized reading of this for our other sister podcast, Catholic Culture Audiobooks, because Gerard Wedgemer, who recommended you to me, also gave me permission to use that, or rather gave our voice actor permission to use that. So that's something that we'll probably put on Moore's feast day on June 22nd.
Well, that's amazing, because that really is it's such a deep, multi-layered, brilliant dialogue. And it brings these questions out. No one has done it better. Throughout, though, if you read it and you underline wherever conscience comes up, you will find Moore really speaks about my conscience and his conscience. So there's an undeniable aspect that Moore believes that there is this unalterable aspect of conscience, that it is your own. But again, that is very much in keeping with traditional Catholic thinking. If I might read a little bit from St. John Paul II, we're under his patronage right now. In Veritatis Splendor, St. John Paul says, according to St. Paul, conscience in a certain sense confronts man with the law, and thus becomes a witness for man, a witness of his own faithfulness or unfaithfulness with regard to the law, of his essential moral rectitude or iniquity. Conscience is the only witness, since that what takes place in the heart of a person is hidden from the eyes of everyone outside. Conscience makes its witness known only to the person himself, and in turn, only the person himself knows what his own response is to the voice of conscience. So this, we could call it a subjective aspect of conscience, is central to it, that one really does have to make up his or her own mind about what I have done and what that means. Whether that is good or bad. And in that same dialogue, Moore makes a distinction along the lines that you just made about where the church has definitively spoken. Okay, so Moore gives large scope to conscience. He makes it very clear that every man may have to follow the law at cost, but no man is bound to say that a given law is good, ever. And he definitely believed, and Jerry Wegner makes it very clear in his scholarship, is that Moore believed that the state, acting as a state, as a political body, did not have the authority. For instance, Parliament does not have the authority to coerce consciences. This is a very big point. Yes, Moore talked about an example in his discussion with Margaret where she is trying to get him to change his mind. She says, he points out that there was a time when the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception was not definitively resolved. And I think he points out that St. Bonaventure was on what ended up being the wrong side of the issue. But while it was being debated, you could not blame a person for whichever stand he took, so long as it was in good faith. So that is one issue. That would be a point where Moore would say it's literally insane to believe otherwise if you have a doubt about that issue and the church has spoken definitively to say, well, no, I'm going to strike out on my own. He really wouldn't be able to understand that. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that, as you sort of said, that you sign over your conscience to the church and then all of a sudden, I have no free will, I can't decide otherwise, because to a large degree, most questions aren't settled definitively because there are so many gray areas in questions.
So, implicit in what you've said, we have Moore's unwillingness seen in the play, his unwillingness to judge the consciences of others. He's very careful about that. And speaking to Norfolk, for example, you also touched on the fact that having freedom of conscience does not necessarily imply freedom from legal consequences to acting according to one's conscience if it's contrary to the law, which I'd like to return to. Let me just ask quickly, so do you think that Moore's views of conscience are more or less in line with those of St. John Henry Newman?
Yes, I do think that's right. I think that you can trace a long tradition, and they're drawing on essentially the same sources.
Is there a reason that these happen to be two English saints, or these two English saints happen to be both very well known for their speech and their stand on this particular topic? Is there something in the English tradition that accounts for that?
Okay, that's a fascinating question. I can't speak to other traditions, but for the English tradition, because of precisely this episode in English history, every serious English thinker afterwards confronted this. Up through the 20th century, so when C.S. Lewis writes a book on words and he discusses conscience, he mainly draws on that very letter that you're going to do a dramatic reading of. How do we understand conscience as an English word? More to help define that. Shakespeare would be another great example. I mean, we know that Shakespeare read Thomas More. We don't know everything he read, but we certainly know he read the history of Richard III because it's a primary source for his play. So in Shakespeare's play, Henry VIII, you can do a search and find out how many times the word conscience is used in that play, and you'd be astounded. Henry's use of conscience in that play is, I think, on purpose, diametrically opposed to the kind of conscience that Moore spoke about. The metaphor that Henry uses is his conscience is like a storm-tossed ship. And he needs someone to solve it, to quiet it. And that's by making things easy for him. Moore saw conscience quite differently. For Moore, the idea is you had to inform your conscience correctly. And well, to get this, a point that is lost in the play, but it doesn't make the play false, is just that, but to help understand this, Bolt mushes together two laws. The first was the act of succession, and that had an oath component. And so that we find out when Meg says, they've got this law and it's got an oath component. That's the act of succession. And that confirms that Anne Boleyn's children will be recognized as heirs. And you get this in the discussion, the interrogation scene. Why won't you affirm that? Well, Moore says, yes, I'll affirm that they are the rightful heirs. Parliament has that power. And then the Archbishop says, well, we find out there's got to be more there. So the Archbishop says, well, in the preamble, it says that essentially that the new marriage is lawful. Is that your problem? Moore won't say, but he spent months and months researching the issue of whether Henry's marriage to Catherine was improper. And he studied the church fathers. He looked at everything. And he came to the conclusion that the marriage was lawful. There was even a trial with the church's representatives in England where Catherine testified, and she said the marriage to Henry's older brother was never consummated. There was a dispensation. He went through all this, and he went through Henry's the passages in Leviticus that were giving Henry the scruple of conscience. And he came out on one side, and he was very honest with the king and explained why he felt that way. And the king graciously accepted that, but came back and back and back. So you've got that. And the question is, could rational people agree to that oath? Because you would have to affirm that the new marriage was lawful. And in addition, this is a very long act, you had to affirm that all sorts of statutes that were recently passed by Parliament that effectively disestablished the church, you would have to swear that you would defend those. So there are two bases where we think that More probably could have said, I cannot swear to that because I cannot swear to something that's false.
Why do you think More was so concerned not to sort of publicly denounce the king's attack on the church? Is it simply because he had a family to protect?
No, I don't think so. And I think that might be, if you come away from the film with that impression, I think that would be a mistaken one. No, I More saw where this was going. And so a lot of people didn't agree. As we know, More was the only layperson asked about this at the beginning, and everyone signed on, including almost all the clergy, except for Bishop Fisher. Even the Carthusian monks who More studied with as a young man, lived alongside it with, very austere, very godly, intelligent, thoughtful people. They signed. This was capable of doubt. I think More took the stand because, one, he felt that in either of those two instances that I mentioned, he was actually affirming something before God that is false. And the other thing is that he really felt that a stand was necessary, that he needed to show himself. He was the leading intellectual figure in Europe, along with Erasmus and I don't know who else. When Cromwell says his silence speaks volumes, that's true. One difference would be that Cromwell wasn't actually the prosecutor. It would have been the Attorney General Hales. But that point is actually true. So I think that More's decision to take this stand, but in silence, was because he believed it was necessary for the Commonwealth.
So despite More's protestations, that, you can't infer any particular thing from my silence, he was aware of how this would be taken.
Absolutely. Everyone knows that. And so the beautiful recourse to the defense, one who is silent, it implies assent. Everyone saw through that as a factual matter. But what More was doing with his silence, there was no right to remain silent at that time. But More was saying, look, the statute, and here's where I was saying they mushed two statutes together. The statute he was prosecuted under for treason was a Treason Act. And that was enacted months after he was imprisoned. So More is called to sign the oath. He refuses. Refusal to sign the oath is punishable as misprision of treason. So if you actually spoke out against the oath, the subject matter of the law, or you wrote against it, that would be actual treason, and you would be subject to death. Merely to not sign the oath was misprision of treason, and that meant forfeiture of all your goods and imprisonment for life. Quite soft sentence, I suppose, in comparison. That's what happened. So he doesn't sign the oath. He's taken immediately to the Tower. Well, pretty much immediately. He's had no trial. He's sitting in prison without a trial. He's eventually convicted by an act of attainder. So no trial, a legislative conviction of misprision of treason. While he's in the Tower, a new statute is passed. And this makes it treasonable, high treason, to maliciously do anything to derogate against the king's titles. What are the king's titles? Well, now the king's title is head of the English church. So now when he's being interrogated, he's being asked about the supremacy, whether he will recognize King Henry as the supreme head of the church in England. Now that's a different question. That's not something that More would have seen as capable of doubt. You can't make a layperson head of the entire church. So for him, that's not a difficult question. But his silence is, I'm not going to give my persecutors any evidence, because the crime is to act maliciously, do something, say something maliciously against the king's title. So by remaining silent, he is not giving them evidence, is how he sees it.
But the fact of his high profile and the fact that he knew how his silence would be construed by people at large, in a sense, probably gave him the freedom to be silent without fearing that, I'm not saying something that I should, for the good of the Commonwealth.
Exactly. So should More have spoken out forcefully? He resigned from public office, and this is pretty well done in the film and in the play, when there's the submission of the clergy, when the clergy finally say, look, okay, you're head of the church now. And what does that mean? Henry now is the final word on church doctrine. No, so at that point he's saying, but before, things had gotten terrible before that, and More still stayed on. Why did he do that? More actually had to read in Parliament as part of his job as being chancellor. When Henry got out and sent for these scholars to give an opinion on the marriage, to give opinion favorable to him, it was More's job to read that opinion out in Parliament. And he did it. He didn't assent or dissent. And when someone says, well, what do you think about it? He said, well, I'm not saying anything, essentially. Why would he do something that must have been excruciating? And the reason was he was working. He was really trying to dissuade, to convince Henry to stay with Catherine. And there was a strong thought that this fancy for Anne Boleyn would pass. He really believed, up until that moment, that he could change the king's mind. And he felt that there was a moral obligation to try.
I see. So I guess there's another big question to talk about, but before we do that, let me ask this. So in our discussion of the film yesterday, the Vatican film list comprises 3 categories. So there's religion, values, and art. And of course, A Man for All Seasons, being about a Catholic saint, is in the religion section. But 2 of the other people I was discussing with, they felt that this film really isn't very much about religion, essentially, and that it should have been under the values section. So I'm curious if you think that the play, obviously the play makes clear he was a religious man and many of his motives were religious, but in its focus, do you think it is really a religious work, or is it more just kind of like a moralistic work?
It's more political work, absolutely. And a great criticism of the film. One of the best Thomas More scholars ever in the 20th century was Clarence Miller, and he wrote a short little essay on the film. And he says, essentially they left out the most important part, that More's stand on conscience is absolutely faith-based.
Yeah, you don't see his asceticism much, for example.
No, you don't.
In the play, he goes to Vespers and everybody's wondering where he is when the king is coming to visit. That's not in the film. But I think that's the one thing in the play where you see that he is pious beyond what other people consider convenient or reasonable.
Oh yes, I think that is true. And when he's called a man for all seasons, that's from Erasmus and an old saying that Erasmus spoke about. And that means much more like being like St. Paul, all things to all men.
Right.
No, I mean, another thing missing from the film is more of his humor. And, one thing that bothers me is the empty house, this massive house. And we only see a few people in it, except for the scene where the courtiers come. The house would have been filled with kids and families. Roper and Meg got married years before.
And of course, Moore had several other children.
So he's got 4 kids. He's got a ward. That married, it's a big family. He's got musical instruments. It's a fun place. When he goes on trips, he brings home the latest inventions, musical instruments, pets. They had a monkey. And you can see that in the Holbein portrait. So yes, there was a piety. When he built this house, he added a whole wing to have his own library and chapel. So Moore went to Mass every day, confession weekly, recited the hours. When he was young, he studied with the Carthusians during a process of discernment. So yes, you can't understand how he could have that courage without the faith.
So the other thing I wanted to talk about is we've talked about sort of conscience, freedom of conscience. More specifically, I'd like to discuss the issue of freedom of religion. This is something that, from the Catholic side, I've seen criticized this idea that Moore was a martyr of conscience. I think that you vindicated that view, but I've seen it criticized by, maybe more, I don't know, integralist types, for example. On the secular side, of course, it's been criticized by, I don't really want to get into the whole Wolf Hall thing, but it's been criticized as inaccurate because of Moore's, involvement in the burning of a few heretics. Pope John Paul II said that, in his treatment of heretics, he was influenced by the limitations of his time. I'm going to remain agnostic as to sort of which saint I agree with on that, because I'm not sure, because it could equally, with respect to John Paul II, it could be, he wasn't laying down a sort of doctrinal principle there, and it could be that, both of them are influenced by the limitations of their time and to some degree in this question. So I don't want to sort of like assume that, say, burning heretics is intrinsically evil, because that certainly hasn't been the church's position in the past. But I think one thing maybe to clear up would be if someone listening to this has heard, for example, that Moore was a torturer of heretics. Is there any truth to that at all?
No. To the extent we can look at the historical record, there is none. The Hilary Mantel book is appalling history in that regard, at least. No, Moore was very clear in his own writings that he had no hand ever in torture. And that makes sense. And he challenged anyone to prove him wrong on that.
Well, actually, let's maybe you could just tell us, sort of give us an overview, exactly what was Moore's involvement with dealing with heretics in general? Just like what was his job in that regard?
Okay. And so for your viewers, if you want to get a picture of this, a great example is the scholarship of Richard Rex, R-E-X. And there's even a great lecture online you can watch. If you plug in Richard Rex and Hilary Mantel, you'll get an amazing lecture for free on this. But to try to condense it as much as possible, the punishment and the crime of heresy in England was burning, and that was established in the year 1400. It was very common in all the states of Europe. Heresy was understood quite differently. Remember, there was no separation of church and state. That doctrine doesn't even make sense in that time. So how was heresy looked at? Well, heresy was looked at as worse than murder. Murder, you kill the person. In heresy, you convince someone to give up their immortal soul. You advocate teachings and beliefs that will prevent a person from being saved, and that will lead to eternal damnation.
So we're talking about the promulgation of heresy specifically.
Exactly.
So were people ever executed simply for having heretical beliefs?
No. So under church law, that the church, the old maxim is the church does not judge secret things. The church was concerned about false teaching. And the political aspect of this is no one believed that you could have a state, a stable state, that wouldn't lapse into civil war if people had different religious beliefs. And this is true of the Protestants too. It's not like you went from Henry VIII's disestablishment of the church and then all of a sudden you got to religious toleration. Quite the opposite. You got the opposite of toleration. Henry was far less tolerant than the kings before him had been. That's why Jonathan Swift condemned him and said that Moore was the greatest champion against tyranny of any Englishman, despite his hatred for the Catholic faith. So, yes, heresy was understood as being a terrible crime and the worst destabilizing force in politics. But you're right, it isn't the belief itself. No one is being said, what do you believe? And now if you say the wrong thing, you'll be convicted as a heretic. You had to have done something. You had to have taught something. And that would give a commission, the bishop, the authority to proceed with a trial. So if a reliable witness said this person was teaching something against the real presence in the Eucharist, that would be a basis for a heresy prosecution. So you have to actually do something.
In fact, that happens to be one of the only instances where Moore said, I've had two people in my household physically disciplined on only 2 occasions, and I forget what one was, but the other one was when one of the young men or something had been teaching heresy about the Eucharist to one of the children of the household.
Correct. The other was a sort of he must have been mad to some degree, but he would sneak up behind the women during Mass and flip up their dresses at the exaltation. So
this was a guy in the neighborhood.
Yeah, and they were both whipped. And he says, apart from them, he says, I've never given so much as a fillip to the forehead to anyone. And that makes total sense, because Moore understood that when he was interrogating people who had been accused of or might be accused of heresy, Moore wanted the salvation of their souls. There's no doubt about it. And a false confession of faith, certainly by torture, would be unthinkable to Moore. It not would only be cruel, but it wouldn't have the intended effect. It wouldn't be meaningful.
Might have the opposite effect.
Exactly. So how did Moore interrogate? You can find that in one of his own books, Dialogue of Heresies, Against Heresies. And you'll see, and probably Roper is the model of the student who is having a 4-day conversation with Thomas More. And you'll see that Moore's method of persuasion is wonderful. It's a real conversation where both sides listen to each other, where they show respect, where there's humor. And Moore absolutely wants this fella to find his own way. So definitely Moore, there's no evidence that Moore engaged in torture, and it's clear that he would have been against it. I tried to find support for where Hilary Mantel got the basis for saying otherwise. I couldn't find anything solid. There was a book of Protestant martyrs by Fox. And so that's online. And I did some searches. And one of the burnings where the victim, I can't remember his name, but where he calls out that in the flames to bless Thomas More, where did that come from? It is in Fox's Book of Martyrs. But Fox revised it over the years, and he didn't keep that one. So, maybe there really wasn't much even to that. But again, I think you see a real similarity, because Moore, when he was condemned, his final words are prayer in favor for the judges, and that they will all meet together in heaven, just as those who St. Peter and St. Stephen. Interestingly, there is pretty strong evidence that Richard Rich, later on in his career, actually personally tortured Protestant heretics, Protestants accused of heresy.
Meaning, from an Anglican point of view, he was torturing Protestants.
Well, Richard's career is phenomenal in that he is really universally condemned as being sort of the worst kind of time server. He was on every side. He remained nominally Catholic, and he had successful careers under Henry, under Mary, under Elizabeth.
Oh, wow!
Yeah.
How about
So
that?
he is known to have. Oh, he even turned on Cromwell when Cromwell was accused of treason and convicted. Rich was one of the main witnesses against him. So,
how about that? Wow.
So that portrayal of seems to be fairly well, and that's an amazing performance by John Hurt.
Who was it at the time who was accusing Moore of torturing? And why did he have to? What circumstances brought about him having to defend himself against that charge?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Well, so there is a strong group of persons, scholars, religious figures, Tyndall, great translator of English vernacular Bible, who were professing these challenging heretical beliefs and challenging Rome. So there was an active two-party system going on there, where Moore was having to defend himself against for his involvement in these trials of heresy, and strong arguments being made that these trials were unfair. Henry's main legal theoretician, Christopher St. Germain, was making very scholarly attacks on church process in heresy prosecutions. So this was an active question during Moore's time. And Moore defended himself. He says, to the extent I was involved, and he was involved in 6, in his role as chancellor, in finding whether there was enough evidence to go from the church to hand the person over to the court system to inflict the punishment. Moore defended that he looked carefully at the process in every one and found that the process was fair.
You mentioned some attitudes of later Protestants towards Moore. What was the attitude of Protestants in, say, the immediately succeeding generations towards him?
I think a strong misrepresentation in Mantel's book is, she says, Moore's jury, they couldn't, someone's asking Cromwell, why is one of Moore's greatest enemies, this Parnell, on the jury? A man who has accused falsely Moore of bribery, who lost a case in Moore's court, and who has been gunning for him, and who's a close relative of the Boleyn family. Why is he there? And Cromwell says, look, everyone hates Moore so much for what he's been doing with heretics. In London, we can't, we had no choice. No, obviously, this was a total setup. The jury was chosen in a way that Moore had to be convicted. Cromwell had barged into the jury when they were in the trial of the Carthusians and told them, the jury, you better hurry up, and you better know what the right answer is. Henry had sent out a publicized letter to be read throughout the public, condemning Moore and Fisher, and this was like the week before the trial. So, no, that wasn't true. So what were Protestants' attitudes?
And it wasn't true that people hated him.
No. One possible source to get a sense of what his standing was is that in Shakespeare's day, one of Shakespeare's final plays that he was involved in was a play called The Play of Sir Thomas More. It never got past the censors. Shakespeare wrote one scene, at least. It's the only scene that's actually we have in Shakespeare's own handwriting. And it's a beautifully crafted scene. I think there are about 4, maybe even 6 playwrights involved in it. And one of them, this Mundy fellow, who was a notorious anti-Catholic under Elizabeth, priest hunter, and yet he wanted to make a play about Thomas More that puts More in an entirely favorable light, where More is referred to without any irony as the greatest friend the poor ever had. And they thought they were going to make money on this play. So this wasn't meant to be satire. This wasn't meant to be irony. And the scene in the play where everyone's handing More the petitions, he was known as a straightforward, fair-minded judge who would listen to the poor. And his courts of equity, that was a main function that they served.
It seems as though if More is regarded as incorrectly to some degree as a champion of freedom of religion, it's only in the sense that the church's doctrine on freedom of religion is frequently misunderstood by, I would say, even modern day, like self-described Orthodox Catholics. So I'm not an integralist, I don't think. I do think that we are in the process of recovering some preconciliar teachings on a number of different topics that have been neglected from, say, like late 19th century, early 20th century encyclicals, including teachings on sort of the rights of the church in terms of coercion and things like that. I don't know exactly where I fall in all that, but there's some movement going on in that direction. So I guess I don't have a really great formulation for my question here, but I guess I'm just wondering, how do you think that More's treatment of heretics, being a canonized saint and in the context of him being a hero of conscience, not being someone who neglected the importance of conscience and the freedom of conscience, what do you think that has to say to our view of religious liberty at this time, our interpretation, say, of Catholic teaching on religious liberty?
I think that what you have to do with More on the one hand is look at his position there as based on the time in which he lived. There was no toleration in that sense, and no one thought there should be. And this was Catholic and Protestant. At that time, tolerance wasn't viewed as a good. Why would you tolerate, no rights to be wrong? It didn't really make sense. And so More was not a champion of religious liberty in that sense. At the same time, you're talking about a world where there was no separation of church and state and where there was no political pluralism. More did have a discussion with Roper, and Roper is exalting how great England is because we're trampling on the heretics. And More said, wait, things could change a lot. Things could be reversed. And in that case, Roper, the best thing would be for them to have their churches quietly and we to have our churches quietly to ourselves. This is a big second best, but there's more sort of looking ahead to a different world and saying, well, how should we act in that type of world? And I think the answer is we should act the way church teaching is today, where although toleration wasn't viewed as a good in the 16th century, 17th century, where you had popes speaking out against it, but church teaching itself, I think you can see a genuine development that is leading to the Vatican II Council documents on religious freedom. And yes, that's where More would be if he were alive today. And you spoke of John Newman. Here we can see a real development in Newman's sense of church doctrine. Church doctrine never required the burning of heretics. So we have a development, and I think More would champion it if he were alive today.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I know of that would kind of there is one papal bull that anathematizes the proposition that that the burning of heretics is against the will of the Holy Spirit. So the proposition that the burning of heretics is against the will of the Holy Spirit is condemned, meaning which would seem to say, if this is an authoritative anathema, that you at least can't say that it's inherently evil to do so.
Yeah, maybe right.
It's not requiring that you be in favor of it in any given circumstance either.
Yeah, perhaps the analogy would be with the death penalty, that it's not definitively against church teaching, but it's certainly not required.
In your opinion, did More act under the limitations of his time or more according to the circumstances of his time? In the sense that was it a limitation of thought, or was it more of a the circumstances being entirely different, and so he actually could have acted entirely rightly, prudentially, according to everything you said about what heresy meant at that time and all that?
Yeah, Richard Rex, in his essay in the Cambridge Companion to Thomas More, excellent collection of essays, deals with the question: is More a fanatic or a statesman? And he comes down solidly on as the second, that More was a statesman, that the belief that heresy had to be a crime under states as they existed at that time was so entrenched that the proper response of a statesman was to ensure due process, limitations on it. That was a statesman-like way of proceeding. Not using it to settle quarrels, not using it to settle scores, not using it unfairly, but that was the way European states operated at that time. And it's not like More ever apologized for there being laws against heresy. He really thought they were necessary to ensure that, as a protection against people being misled. And that was almost universally shared. As it turns out, I don't think that history is proven that that's a great approach, that it doesn't really work. It hasn't worked in the West. And so I think that, yes, I think if you now look at the sweep of history and you look at the Vatican II documents on religious freedom, they're pretty convincing. And I think that, More wasn't a big one for dissenting against the church. I think he would have fully endorsed them. Sure.
I guess, the argument that I've heard is that, Dignitatis Humanae is actually, if you read it carefully, fully compatible with, say, the assertion of the rights of the church in Immortale Dei. The prior teachings in the late 19th century that a confessional state is in fact the ideal, even if a pluralist, even if it's not always prudentially sort of required under different circumstances. So, I guess the debate that's going on today is, over that issue, and then maybe following from that, let's say, if you did somehow, in 100 years from now, have a confessional state, would you then return to the attitude towards the promulgation of heresy, legally speaking, that was held in Christendom? So I don't know that we can resolve that issue here, but
correct. I don't think we can. I think that yes. What would be appropriate in a confessional state, and what would be appropriate in a modern pluralistic state, Republican government, is a different question. But it should be noted that there's no doubt on one thing, that More was a strong proponent of republicanism understood in the ancient tradition of Aristotle through Cicero. I mean, he was not a big fan of kingship, except under a constitutional setting. He felt that Parliament really should be in charge. And he had to be a bit careful on how he said that.
Well, it seems like he would be more in line with, at least, if the play is accurate, when he talks about words, the words of oaths, the words of laws, it seems like you can sort of tell where he would come down to some extent in the recent debate over originalism, for example.
Yeah, and there's no doubt that More, and this is a great aspect of Bolt's play, that Bolt really got More's respect for rule of law. And that amazing speech about tearing down all the laws, but our land is planted thick with laws, man's laws, and if you tear them down, Roper, and you're just the man to do it, would you be able to stand in the winds that would blow? That's Bolt, absolutely. And it's been quoted by the Supreme Court and I don't know how many other courts. But it's very true to More. And when it's mixed into a conversation where they're criticizing More for giving the devil his due, well, More actually did say that if the devil was on one side and my father was on the other, the devil having good cause should get the judgment. He absolutely said that. So yes, More has a very strong belief that rule of law is central to the Commonwealth.
What are the, other than the dialogue on conscience, which we'll be recording for Catholic Culture audiobooks, what other primary sources should people look at to learn more about More's views on conscience? That
absolutely would be the primary source. His letters, his final letters to Meg, where he discusses his interrogations. So the final letters are great. There's a new edition of the letters edited by Steve Smith at Hillsdale. And that's, I've got it here, it's a Scepter. So that's selected letters, and they're beautiful. And this is an affordable book, beautifully edited. Steve Smith is really one of the great young Moore scholars.
What about the trial documents? Are those something that a layperson would be able to profit from reading?
Yes. In the book that I helped edit, there are some great documents. There's even a sort of fictional, what's called a docudrama, where all the sources, the original sources of the trial are sort of put together. And there are two main sources, Roper's biography that was based on eyewitness testimony. Roper wasn't there, but it was written about 20 years after the fact. And then there's a Guildhall report that came in a Paris newsletter that was a contemporaneous account. So you get both of those. They're both very readable. The trial is fascinating. And Bolt is fairly close to the Roper version. You don't need any training in law or history to read those. There is an incredible new development in Moore scholarship, and that is the publishing of a new work called The Essential Works of Thomas More.
Ah, yes.
And that's Yale Press. It's a rather big book, and I think it's $100, but it's astounding.
It's cheaper than getting the complete Yale works of Thomas More, which I have just the first volume of.
Yes, and those complete works are amazing, but they were actually never finished.
Oh, no?
Yale didn't finish it. It's pretty close, but for instance, there are no letters. But no, it's amazing. If you can find them, the one to look for, I think it's volume 14, is The Sadness of Christ, De Tristitia. And that is one of the great all-time works of scholarship. That has More's own handwriting, his holograph, they found in Valencia. So you can see his own handwriting in Latin on one side. Then Clarence Miller has it on the other side, and he's got his translation right there, and then accompanying volume of notes. And for lay reading, Sadness of Christ, his final work, is amazing spiritual reading, especially Lenten. It's a short treatise on the Passion, but only gets as far as, it doesn't get very far. It gets up to the arrest.
Is it unfinished, or is that just how far he went?
That's how far he went. His purpose was to figure out how to be a martyr if called upon when one is not a courageous martyr. What do we do when we're a fearful martyr, like Thomas was? And it is fascinating, and it has some amazing passages. Moore's humor, you mentioned that, is even there. He has a passage describing how we pray that is one of the funniest things ever. And he talks about how, what are we actually, maybe we ought to reflect on how we just did our prayer. What were we actually doing? And he has a beautiful discussion of how our mind is wandering, our bodies are wandering, we're fidgeting, we're cleaning our fingernails with our pocket knife and picking our nose, stuff like that. So it's very serious. And at the same time, he even finds humor in the gospel passage concerning the sleeping apostles, where he makes an argument that Jesus is using irony when he tells them, when he comes back the third time and says, sleeping again? Go sleep and have your rest. And then tells them to get up. And Moore says, well, I think he's being ironic there. He's not really telling them to go to sleep again. And he's saying, I know St. St. Augustine felt differently, and he had this other explanation, and I'm not going to say I'm right and he's wrong. But anyway, so it's really a phenomenal read, very accessible.
Thank you so much for coming on the show to enlighten us on this. I feel like that the play has been, vindicated to a large extent. It may not be a fundamentally religious work of fiction, but it is still, as far as it goes, seems to be largely accurate.
I'd agree.
All right. Thanks for coming on.
My huge pleasure. Thanks so much.
All right, everybody. Thanks for listening. If you go to the show notes page at catholicculture.org/criteria, you'll find that I've linked to a whole lot of resources on the page for this episode. A number of the books mentioned, of course, and the lecture by Richard Rex that Louis mentioned. Of course, the Center for Thomas More Studies, which Louis, as I mentioned earlier, was a founding fellow of. Of course, James Majewski and I had our normal discussion episode on this film a couple days ago, so you can find that in the Criteria feed or linked in the show notes for this page. That's a discussion where we talk more about the formal aspects of the film, and particularly how it handles adapting a theatrical work to the medium of film. And over at Catholic Culture Audiobooks, James and his wife, Karina, also an actor, have done a wonderful dramatic reading of Moore's Dialogue of Conscience, which featured in this discussion with Louis Karlin. I'll add the link to that when it comes out on the 22nd. If you're interested in following up on some of the issues I mentioned of the interpretation of the Church's older and more recent teaching on religious liberty, I've linked to a couple of interesting essays. One is on catholicculture.org in our library. It's by William Marshner, titled Dignitatis Humanae and Traditional Teaching on Church and State, and another one by Thomas Pink in First Things, titled Conscience and Coercion. So again, you can go to catholicculture.org/criteria to find links to all this stuff. A couple other things about criteria coming up. First, because the film Gone with the Wind has been a subject of controversy lately, James and I decided to record a kind of bonus episode on that, even though it's not on the Vatican film list, so you can expect that in about a week's time. The next film from the Vatican list that we'll be discussing, as mentioned on the previous episode, is Krzysztof Kieslowski's Dekalog, or specifically the first short film in that 10-part series. This is one of the harder films on the Vatican list to get your hands on and watch, so I've put some tips on how you can do that in the show notes page for today's episode. So again, you can go to catholicculture.org/criteria to check those out. Finally, if you'd be interested in supporting our work at Catholic Culture, and especially in our podcasts, please go to catholicculture.org/donate/audio to help us out. Okay, everybody, so happy Feast of St. Thomas More, and may he intercede for us in this crazy time our nation is going through. See ya in a week in the Old South.